a result of cellular respiration. And it diffuses into the blood, comes through the venous blood and the systemic system, goes to the right atrium, the right ventricle, out of the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary artery, down to the pulmonary capillaries, and then it diffuses to into the alveoli and out. And it's carried in three primary ways in the blood. 10% is dissolved directly in the plasma. Another 20% approximately binds to the hemoglobin. And finally, the majority of it is transformed by this equation in the red blood cells to hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. Well, bicarbonate is for the CO2. And then it diffuses on out. It goes out of the red blood cell in exchange for chloride ion, chloride exchange. It comes into the red blood cell and out. And when you get to the lungs, it reverses. So let me say that one more clearly. At the cells in the blood, carbon dioxide goes into the red blood cell, and then it exchanges for chloride ion. And then when you get to the lungs, the bicarbonate ion comes back into the red blood cell and reverses its reaction and forms carbon dioxide, then CO2 diffuses out into the alveoli and we breathe it out. All right, well, we know from this equation that indeed the carbon dioxide levels affect our pH, our acid-base balance. And we know that because the more CO2 you get, by the rule of mass action, we drive the equation to the right and we form more hydrogen ions. So, our breathing can affect our acid-base balance, our pH. Now, the first thing that could potentially happen if you have altered breathing is respiratory acidosis. We call it respiratory acidosis because it's due to a respiratory or a breathing problem. Now, in general, this could be caused by a low ventilation rate. You could call this hypoventilation, but in physiology, we actually use a more precise definition of hypoventilation. And that definition is an increase in the ratio of carbon dioxide production compared to alveolar ventilation. That seems a little odd, but if you get an increase in carbon dioxide production compared to your alveolar ventilation, that's our precise definition of hypoventilation. Often, this is caused by a decreased breathing rate when we're at rest. This causes accumulation of CO2 in the internal environment. Our pH decreases because we're driving that equation to the right, putting more hydrogen ions in solution. Why would you have a decreased breathing rate? Well, somebody who's taken barbiturates, that would artificially decrease their breathing rate, for instance. So that's one possible reason. Or you could have damage to your neuronal system, to your muscles for respiratory breathing, and that could decrease your breathing rate, for instance. So there's some examples that could cause this. And that could send us into respiratory acidosis due to a respiratory cause. Now, on the other hand, you could have respiratory alkalosis. This would be due to hyperventilation, which again, we use a more precise definition. It can often mean just your breathing rate goes up, you're hyperventilating, but the precise definition is a decrease in the ratio of carbon dioxide to your alveolar ventilation. If you're hyperventilating, your breathing rate going up, for instance, you can blow off too much CO2 because your breathing rate's going up. You'll be taking in more oxygen. Well, that doesn't bother the body if you take in excess amounts of oxygen. But it is a problem if you exhale excessive amounts of CO2. That drives your equation in the opposite direction. You take hydrogen ions out of solution and you become a higher pH, or you have alkalosis. In this case, again, your pH is off. We don't want acidosis or alkalosis because it changes the shape of our proteins. Our enzymes don't work as well. Any of our proteins are not functioning as well if they're not in the correct pH environment. And so this is an issue. What could cause hyperventilation? Well, sometimes if we get a little excited or panicky, we can have hyperventilation. We're ready for a big race, or we're ready for a big event, and we're getting so geared up, and we just start really breathing, or we're really nervous because you have to go on and act in a play or something, and we're just getting really excited, and we breathe too fast.
Can you get alkalosis from other things too?
Oh yes. Now let's talk about metabolic acidosis and alkalosis a little bit. This one would be respiratory caused. Sometimes if it's respiratory caused and the person is kind of in a panic attack and they're breathing too much, you might give them a paper bag to breathe into for a while. The value of that is, it's true you're breathing more rapidly, but you're breathing that CO2 out in the bag and you're breathing in higher concentrations of CO2 instead of what's in the atmosphere. And if you do that for a while, you might help get your pH back in balance, and you might be able to calm down and take the bag away. Now, what Maddie's talking about really is, well, yes, we can get respiratory caused acidosis and alkalosis, but can't we get it due to other reasons? Yes, we can get metabolic acidosis. We talked quite a bit about it in diabetes, didn't we? If we have untreated diabetes, we break down a higher proportion of fats and we get ketoacidosis, which is a type of metabolic acidosis. It's not due to our breathing rate or a breathing problem. It's due to a metabolic problem. And the interesting thing is, if your breathing is okay and you get metabolic cause acidosis, you would actually increase your breathing rate to help compensate for the metabolic acidosis. You would actually want to breathe out more rapidly, more CO2. If you increase your breathing rate, you breathe out more CO2, that helps fix or compensate your metabolic acidosis. And the same, only the reverse, for metabolic alkalosis. If anything is causing your metabolism to get too alkaline, your pH is going up too much, you could slow your breathing. You could have a respiratory compensation, and you could retain more CO2. Now, you can only do that within certain limits, because if you're slowing your breathing, you're also getting less oxygen in, right? And we know that can make it worse. But within a certain limit, you could slow your breathing and you could compensate with that. So the acidosis and alkalosis could be respiratory caused. They have a breathing issue, or it can be caused by metabolic, and that would be a metabolism caused issue. The respiratory system could help compensate for that within certain limits. What else helps compensate? Well, our body buffers, of course, compensate for changes in pH, and our urinary system, our kidneys. If you're acidic for either cause, respiratory or metabolic, you could excrete more hydrogen ions and reclaim more bicarbonate ions and let it not allow it to go in the urine. And so that could compensate it. And if you have alkalosis, you could excrete more bicarbonate ions and reabsorb more hydrogen ions. So those are things that it could be used to compensate if we have these issues. Do we feel okay on that? So, what about breathing? How do we control breathing? We recall that our breathing is controlled by, we need to have our skeletal muscles, certain of them contracting in our diaphragm, or external and internal intercostals, or sternocleidomastoid. We need to lift up the rib cage. We need to pull down for inspiration, our diaphragm. How do we control that? Well, we have a breathing center, the so-called rhythmicity center in the brain, specifically in the medulla oblongata. We talked about that a bit in the nervous system, but there it is again. The rhythmicity center is in the medulla oblongata, and that's our major control center. You may remember when we talked about the medulla oblongata, we said we have three vital reflexes. We have the cardiac center, which controls our heart rate. The heart is autorhythmic, but if we want to raise it up, down, around that baseline, we can do it with the cardiac center. We have the vasomotor center, which controls our blood pressure up and down. And then finally, we have the rhythmicity center, or the area that controls our respiration, our breathing rate. And that will send signals, for instance, via the phrenic nerve down to our diaphragm and to other muscles, and that will cause breathing. Well, our normal breathing rate at rest is probably about 12 to 15 times per minute. In addition to this rhythmicity area, we have two other areas which are in the pons, not in the medulla, which assist the rhythmicity area in the medulla oblongata in their breathing control tasks. So let's talk about each of these. First, the rhythmicity center, that's this here. We have a dorsal and a ventral. Dorsals to the back, ventrals to the front of this area. And the dorsal respiratory group is primarily involved in inspiration. It sends signals via the phrenic nerve and the spinal nerves to innervate the respiratory muscles. And this causes primarily inspiration. The ventral, the one that's more anterior in the front, is mostly expiration. Expirations can be passive or it can be active for speaking and singing and the like, but the ventral respiratory group controls expiration. The activity of the excitatory neurons from the ventral group inhibit inspiration so that you don't have both trying to go at the same time. So breathing in and then breathing out in this rhythmic pattern. Well, what about the other two centers from the pons? The apnoestric center is a constant promotion or excitation of inspiration during inspiration. It's like a cheerleader. So while the rhythmicity center, the dorsal area, is causing us to breathe in, the apnoestic center is saying, breathe, breathe, breathe. It's trying to get us to keep breathing in, because breathing in is so important. And so that's helpful for that. So it provides what we would say a constant stimulus for inspiration during the inspiratory phase of breathing. Then it switches, and at the end of inspiration, it inhibits inspiration. It says, okay, stop breathing in for a bit. The pneumotaxic center smooths out the transition between inspiration and expiration. Otherwise, our breathing would be kind of jagged, like as we're trying to transition from inspiration to expiration. So this makes it a nice, smooth transition. And so that's helpful. So those are the centers for controlling breathing. We have one other breathing reflex, and that's called the Herring-Bauer reflex. In our lung tissue, we have sensory receptors called pulmonary stretch receptors. They're a type of pressure transducer. And if you overstretch your lungs, they will send a signal to inhibit inspiration. They're saying, you took too deep a breath, stop. So they'll inhibit inspiration. And that's called the Herring-Bauer reflex. Now, we have these respiratory rhythmicity centers that are going to control breathing. But how do we know when we need to increase our breathing rate or decrease it? We know, for instance, when we exercise, we need to increase our breathing rate. And after we stop, we need to decrease it. Well, what tells these centers when to crank it up or crank it down? Well, we look at three gases, or three substances. Two are a gas and one is a hydrogen ion. So we're looking at oxygen levels, CO2, and hydrogen ion. Okay? So we're looking at the PCO2, the PO2, and the pH, or the hydrogen ion concentration. But we look at these three, well, we look at some of these in two different places. In the central chemoreceptors, they will only respond to hydrogen ion. In the peripheral chemoreceptors, where they found the carotid arteries and the aortic arteries, bodies, they will respond primarily to CO2 and hydrogen ion, but they will also respond to oxygen. Let's look at that a little bit more. First, the peripheral. In the peripheral, this area right here is your aortic arch coming out of the heart. You're not quite going up to the carotid arteries yet. We call these the aortic bodies. We have chemoreceptors there, and they respond to CO2, PCO2, if you will, partial pressure carbon dioxide, hydrogen ion, and oxygen. We're going to show you some evidence in just a minute that they respond mostly or most sensitively not to oxygen, but to carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion. That does not seem intuitive at all, but that's the way it is. We can actually decrease our PO2 pretty dramatically before we stimulate increased in ventilation rate. But small changes in PCO2 or hydrogen ion concentration cause almost immediate changes in our breathing rate. Interesting. By the way, of course, increases in O2 and hydrogen ion would stimulate increase in breathing, but a decrease in oxygen would cause an increase in breathing rate. That makes intuitive sense, so now it's a little easier. Well, what about the central chemoreceptors? Here's peripheral. They respond to decreased PO2, but not as much as increased hydrogen ion and increased PCO2. We always want to keep in mind that increased hydrogen ion is a decreased pH. I know you know that, it's just to remind you. The central chemoreceptors, they're located in the medulla oblongata, where the rhythmicity center is. They respond to hydrogen ion, but hydrogen ions don't cross the blood-brain barrier very well. There's that barrier between the blood and the brain that's protective for the brain. And hydrogen ions don't cross it. Hydrogen ions don't cross it too well. So what happens is, as your PCO2 goes up, your carbon dioxide crosses the blood-brain barrier into the medulla, and then by that familiar equation, it gets converted into hydrogen ions, which is what binds directly to the chemoreceptor. And so the direct effect is the binding of hydrogen ion. But you have to have CO2 crossing. So that's what this is down here in green. Carbon dioxide crosses the blood-brain barrier and is converted to hydrogen ion, which binds directly to the chemoreceptor. That's what this Okay, here's what we were talking about. This is our minute ventilation, and this is our arterial PO2. You notice that the normal is 100. Now, as we decrease our PO2, look at how far it decreases before we get any significant increase in our breathing rate. That seems pretty incredible, doesn't it? You would think we'd start breathing faster before we get to that point. But this is why we say that it's carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion which are more important in controlling our breathing rate than oxygen. If it gets low enough, we will stimulate our peripheral chemoreceptors and increase our ventilation rate. Well, what about our arterial PCO2? It's normally at 40 millimeters of mercury. Look at how little of an increase you need in the partial pressure of CO2 to get an increase in our minute ventilation, in our breathing rate, essentially. It goes up quite steeply, doesn't it? And it's very little, doesn't take much at all to increase it. And of course, what happens here is if you have carbon dioxide, you will get some of it stimulating directly with the CO2 receptors, some of it converted to hydrogen ion and stimulating receptors, both peripherally and in the central and medulla oblongata. And that will increase your respiration and get you back into homeostasis. How about hydrogen ion, or pH? Look at that. It's pretty linear, isn't it? A small change in your hydrogen ion concentration, or a decrease in your pH, if you will cause a breathing rate to increase. There's really no lag. It just, right away, it's starting an increase in breathing rate. So this is just to convince us that carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion are more important, at least initially, in changing our breathing rate, increasing our breathing rate, for instance. Oxygen, eventually, if your PO2 goes down enough, will have a strong stimulatory effect on breathing rate. But it's not going to do it until you get a pretty good decrease in your PO2. So that's what that's illustrating for us. This shows you again arterial. When we say production of non-CO2 acid, that's metabolic acid. That's from the breakdown of fats into ketones or anything else that's forming an acid. And so that's going to then increase our arterial hydrogen ion, and that can directly bind to the peripheral chemoreceptors and stimulate them. How about the central? No, you have to have the CO2 going across and then turning into hydrogen ions, going across the blood-brain barrier, and then that would increase it. So this puts all of these together in one flow chart. Decreased PCO2, increase of non-CO2 hydrogen ion, increase in arterial partial pressure carbon dioxide, and all of that will lead to the same thing. Stimulate the diaphragm and the inspiratory intercostal muscles and increase ventilation rate. Get us back into balance. How about when we're under, when we're putting it under work, exercise? As we're going way down here at the bottom, from rest to work to maximum work, as we're going in that direction, notice our breathing rate goes up. The more we do, the higher it goes. Obviously, it can only reach a certain peak and then it will plateau out, but this is, you can see it going up. This is so effective normally. If we don't have any disease or we're not at high altitude, notice that our arterial PO2 changes very little. It's pretty steady because the increase in breathing matches the demand. Now, this is only true if we have submaximal exercise, aerobic exercise, if you will. If you're jogging or running a marathon or something, you are not exerting a maximal force of exercise. And as long as you stay submaximally, you can match, and you have enough nutrients to use to convert it to ATP, you can match the, you can get enough oxygen to generate enough ATP to go on for a long time. Now you can't go on forever, but I can't run a marathon, but some of you probably could. You can go on for a pretty long time, okay? It can match it. Now, that's different if you're doing maximal exercise, an anaerobic, like a sprint. You're doing a 100-yard dash, or you're swimming in the pool as fast as you can, or anything like that. In that case, you are not being able to deliver enough oxygen to your cells and to your mitochondria to make enough ATP. So your sprint must end fairly shortly because you run out of ATP, because you run out of oxygen. You're not delivering enough. So we call that anaerobic, because the only exercise, the only ATP we're getting is from anaerobic means, glycolysis and the like. And so we get a lot less ATP per glucose molecule or whatever if we're in anaerobic only and not using the citric acid cycle and electron transport chain and all that. And we get an oxygen debt. So after we do a sprint, we have some recovery time, don't we? And we have to breathe and get some more oxygen in there. So sprinting will be an anaerobic exercise, and if it's aerobic, you can go longer time, much longer time. So this shows you as we're increasing that oxygen consumption. We can keep it as long as we're submaximal. If we reach way up to maximal, then we're going to see a problem. We're going to have to stop. Our oxygen levels are going to fall. We can also have an anticipatory increase in breathing before we exercise. We're going to start exercising, we're stretching a little bit, we're getting ready to go, and our breathing rate can go up before the demand goes up, before we start exercising. So there's some anticipation. And then we start exercising right here, but our breathing rate has already gone up some. And then it keeps going up as the demand goes up. And then after we stop exercising, it's starting to go down during the recovery time. We have this oxygen debt, and we have to keep our breathing rate higher than resting for a while until we recover. The better shape we're in, the faster our recovery time. Our heart rate would go down faster, our breathing rate would go down, because we've got a very efficient system. But we still need that recovery time. It just would be shorter in somebody who's in very good shape. In addition to these major factors of oxygen, carbon dioxide, hydrogen ion, we have other things that can impact our breathing rate. Temperature, a conditioned response. Every day at this time, you're going to do some deep breathing, so you start doing that. And we get some feedback from different areas. So all this can affect our breathing rate. Plasma, epinephrine, potassium concentration, things like that. So all these can impact our rate of breathing. Now this looks intimidating, but it's really not so bad. This is a table from your book, but let's talk about it a little bit. What causes a decrease in arterial PO2? It has a funny name. It's called hypoxic hypoxemia. Okay, what causes that? Well, there's a number of things that can cause it. Here are some of the major ones. Hypoventilation. What are some examples of hypoventilation? And here we're using getting less oxygen to the alveolar, the respiratory exchange areas, our alveolar ventilation. So if you have a defect in your respiratory control pathway, so you're not breathing properly, or if you have damage to your respiratory muscles, maybe you were born with a muscle degenerative disease and they don't work very well after a while, or if you have severe thoracic cage abnormalities, can't lift your thoracic cage anymore, or not as much, or obstruction in your airway. All of this, of course, will cause that. Diffusion impairment. Oxygen has to diffuse from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. It's a short little barrier normally. Any kind of fluid, any kind of thickness that thickens that will cause less oxygen to diffuse into the blood, and that will cause it. An intrapulmonary defect, if you're mixing venous blood with oxygenated blood, that can be a problem. A shunt. So anything like this. An AV malformation is when we're shunting blood directly from the arteries to the veins without going through the capillaries. So an AV malformation is what really we're talking about with a shunt. And finally, the most important, or common at least, is ventilation perfusion inequality. Remember quite a while ago we said at sea level, the PO2 of oxygen is about 105 in the alveoli. But the PO2 in our systemic arterial blood is only about 100. And that would include the pulmonary venous blood and the left side of the heart and the arteries of the systemic system. It's only about 100. And we said, well, there's a reason it doesn't totally equilibrate to 105. And the reason is this last one, this ventilation perfusion inequality. What does that mean? We move a certain amount of gas, air, in and out of our lungs. And we move a certain amount of blood, perfusion, through our lungs. If there was an absolute equal match, a 1-to-1 ratio between the volume of air and the volume of blood that we move, we would be great. There would be no inequity. That almost never happens. We always have a difference between the amount of air that we move to the lungs and the amount of blood, perfusion, that we move. And the more that's off, the more problems we'll have. And so that is the major reason we don't get complete equilibration with our oxygen in the blood compared to the oxygen in the alveoli. And the worse off it can get, you can get worsening hypoxemia. COPD, for instance, makes it progressively worse because you're damaging your lung tissue, so you're not able to move as much air as blood, and so you're getting, that ratio is progressively getting further and further away from normal. So those are the causes from that. One last thing on the respiratory system is how do we acclimate to high altitude? Well, the first one's pretty obvious. We'll breathe faster. The second one's also probably pretty obvious. We'll secrete more erythropoietin from the kidneys, which will cause more erythrocyte production, so we can transport more oxygen in the blood to the cells. Another one, DPG increases. That unloads more oxygen to the tissues. Over time, we could also increase our capillary density. That would take a little longer. And we could keep more of our blood. We could increase our blood volume. When I say that, we reduce plasma volume, concentrating the erythrocytes. So I should really say we increase our erythrocyte relative erythrocyte compared to water in the blood. These are things that can be used to acclimate to high altitude. Now, there is a limit. If you have too many red blood cells, you can actually increase the viscosity, the resistance to flow of the blood. And that could then be a negative as far as fluid, because your blood flow would be decreased, if you remember that equation. So that is a possible detriment if we increase our erythrocytes too much compared to our plasma volume. Anything you want to chat about the respiratory system?
Just with this last point, there's actually been some research done into populations a little bit higher elevations. They have like different expressions for, like, for example, density of like hemoglobin in the red blood cells, things like that. I find it interesting because it runs in my family, because my dad's from out of Peru, runs from family there.
So you can acclimate, which is you live at a lower elevation and you go up when you spend a few days and you acclimate, or you can have adaptation, which is genetic, passing down the genetic traits. And so what would be some of the things? Bigger lung volume, shorter stature, you don't have to oxygenate as much, greater red blood cell count, higher hemoglobin, things of that nature. Now that would be an adaptation. And people that live at high altitude, like the Andes in Peru and things like that, they can develop some of these. And the Sherpas that work, hauling stuff up Everest and stuff like that, it's much easier for them because they're biologically more adapted to doing those things. And so that's part of it as well. You can actually get greater changes to allow that kind of thing. And so, yeah, that's a very good point, because that is not just acclimation, it's adaptation. You're actually changing your body, your genetics, to give those kind of things. So if you took a bunch of Peruvians that live in high altitude and a bunch of people who live in low altitude, and you measure their lung volumes, you'd almost guarantee that they would have a greater, especially when you compare it to their body size.
Just as an anecdote, when my dad first came for a doctor checkup, he was side by side with this like 6'6" like white guy. My dad had a lung capacity of 5 liters, and by the way, it's like 5'4",
Right.
very solid guy. The other guy had like 4 liters,
Right, and he was like 6 foot something.
like 6 liters or something.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so, if you were just taking height, you would say, oh, the taller would have a bigger lung capacity and all that, and that's what would be in a whole population, but you're not just taking height into consideration, right? You're taking other stuff, so that's exactly right. And, yeah, a lot of long distance runners that are really good tend to be on the shorter, they can run forever, right? Ethiopians, right, can run forever. Right, you're really good at long distance. But if you're gonna do a sprint, it's the taller people, right? The taller ones, they can really go, or short, they can really go. Because they got the long stride,